All right, hello everyone, and thanks for having us here today. We're excited to present our M3 2021 paper on the future of global interconnection.
So yeah, just a brief overview of the overall problem. So part one would be to model the costs of bandwidth in megabits per second over the next decade. Part two is to model a given household's need for internet over the course of the year. And we want to determine the minimum bandwidth to cover their needs for 90% and 99% of the time. And part three, predict the optimal distribution of cell towers in the given M3 provided regions.
So to understand all three of our models, it's important to kind of understand our ideological approach to these problems. There's three main tenets we want to go over. The first is that we always want to start from the foundation. So instead of assuming something like internet prices will change, we want to identify the causal factors behind that and model those causal factors. Secondly, very related, is we want to model the internal dynamics of systems because we have all these technical computing resources at our disposal. So instead of modeling so we want to model, for example, what somebody will do inside of a day and how that affects their internet consumption, not just their internet consumption as a whole. And finally, we recognize that we won't always have access to the best data because of the limited time frame of the tournament, of the competition. So we want to prioritize one, models that are robust to that, and two, models that are not limited in scope because of potential limited amounts of data.
Yeah, so for the first problem, we thought first, what makes internet prices change? And we thought prices will increase only if the companies providing internet can't make a profit supplying bandwidth at the current price. And we thought prices will decrease only when forced to by competition.
So operating under those two assumptions, we're able to make what we call an agent-based Monte Carlo simulation. So we modeled a bunch of internet service providers acting in their best interests to maximize profits over the course of a decade by moving into new markets, and as Joseph talked about, disrupting the price equilibria and recalculating new prices. So we chose 26 agents based on our assumptions about the number of ISPs that are capable of expansion. And then every year, each agent assesses whether to expand, whether they have the capabilities, that might be capital and resources, to expand into a new region. And if they do, then they expand into a new region where the potential for profit, which is calculated as price differential multiplied by population, is largest. So if they move into a disrupted market, then the new price equilibrium of that market is based on the transit cost, so the variable price of internet to the internet service provider, and the cost buffer, which accounts for all the other constant costs on behalf of the internet service provider. So a new price equilibrium is reached when they move into a new region, and then this happens for all 26 agents over 10 years. You can see here, this is some commented code of the model where we iterate through every year, so the whole decade, and we iterate through each of the 26 ISPs for the US. And then we update price data by making actions on their behalf because they're acting as agents in the model. Then we do this whole thing 1,000 times to get results. And one of the great things about the fact that it's a Monte Carlo simulation is, in addition to having the individual results for each of the locations, as you can see in this table here, we also have histogram results, probability distributions for what the price might be in 1 decade from now. So instead of just settling on one price for a place like Amman, Idaho, we can see that over half the time the model predicts that they might not receive any price change at all. And this is because they're a more rural area with smaller population and less infrastructure, and which is a really important result for something like addressing internet equity. Now, if we look at this the price evolution over time, you can see that a place like New York will see its price decrease almost every single year, whereas a place like Amman, Idaho, only sees its internet price decrease in the last couple of years, if at all. So that's one of the great things about using technical computing on a problem like this, is that by simulating the internal dynamics instead of just a regression that we put on top of all the data, we're able to see a lot more nuance, such as what happens to smaller places like Amman, Idaho, compared to larger places like New York. At the same time, because the model has this nuance, we want to make sure that it's not creating this nuance out of thin air from possibly inaccurate starting data. So we want to first of all test robustness, and secondly, because the model is pretty complicated, we want to test whether the model fits with historical comparisons.
Yeah, so to test how the model works with historical data, we used San Francisco data, and we found that San Francisco had a predicted 10-year 133% increase in number of ISPs. And the actual data indicates an 83% increase in number of ISPs over the past 7 years, or extended to 10 years, and 137% increase. And we also tested the price, and we found our predicted price to be 59 cents per megabit per second. And we found the actual price to be 50 cents per megabit per second. We also did sensitivity analysis, and we found that our model was in general not very sensitive to most parameters. For example, we changed number of initial competitors, and we found a very small change. But our model is sensitive to our initial pricing data, where a 10% plus or minus increase in median price over median speed leads to a 13% change in our output. We also wanted to compare our model to a more traditional regression. And we found that the regression was not a very good predictor, as at least for the US, it was giving us a negative value for price, which makes no sense.
So our approach for question 2 was to leverage computational methods to address for the ambiguity in the problem statement. Specifically, we generated ranges of profiles for each of the households, where each profile had different rates of internet consumption. And by running simulations and aggregating the results, we were able to create a range of possible internet consumption rates. So the first thing I did was we used the data in column D4 of the given M3 data, and to address for the increased amount of internet and TV usage in the from the pandemic, some values were increased by 70% or 12% respectively, corresponding to internet and TV usage increases. So the core component of our solution to problem 2 was profiles, where each profile represents a person, which has the following properties as shown on the screen. For example, and these properties affect internet usage rates. So for example, if we know a person is an employed essential worker, we can expect them to be outside of the house for 8 to 10 hours a day. Therefore, during that time, the required amount of internet bandwidth will be lower than usual. The next part of generating profiles is implying the inputs that were not given. For example, in our problem statement, for the households, we're given age, income, and sometimes if they're employed or if they're in school, but that's not enough information to generate a complete profile. So what we do is we take the given factors and probabilistically determine the rest of the factors. For example, if we're just given a person is age 20, we know there's a 38% chance that they are in school, so we can generate profiles around that probability. You might have also noticed 2 of our variables are 4K Ultra HD and large file download frequency, which are natural anomalies given that the rest of our data appears to be a lot more important and significant. But what these 2 pieces of data represent is they represent anomalies in internet consumption. These are the pieces of data that we were given in the M3 data that require the most amount of internet bandwidth. And thus, these essentially act as representations of times when households will use more internet, will use a far larger amount of internet consumption. For example, times when, like family time, where everyone's watching a movie together, or maybe you'll expect less usage during dinner times. So it represents that. The next thing we did for each of the profiles is we ran a simulation. On the next slide, the simulation ran week by week. So show the next slide. So this is a week for just one profile, and you can see there are spikes and lulls in the internet usage, and these correspond to times when people are sleeping or people have free time. So what we did was for each household and each person in the household, we generated 100 random profiles and ran these profiles for an entire year, aggregated the results, and created these probability density graphs as shown on the screen. So the strengths of this model is the flexibility in taking inputs to the different households. It's very flexible, and you can design households for however many people you want. and with different sorts of people. However, the weakness is that we do not address fully the extent of different internet activities, and that's due to the lack of data that we had.
Okay, and now for question 3, our first step was to calculate bandwidth demands for the M3 provided regions based on 2 main parameters. So those were age and income. And as for the actual model, we used simulated annealing to kind of locate the optimal configuration of power of bandwidth, like of the cell towers. So the first step was the data processing. So in the M3 provided data, it was pretty much the only parameter was either age or income. So the main goal for this data part was to combine the two, so we could have 2 parameters. So basically figure out maybe like for a given income range and age, like what's the amount of megabits per second used. So you can kind of see the required megabits per second in region A in the table here and its corresponding subregions. So we did that for the other regions as well. And that's kind of what we fed into our model.
So we took these 3 hypothetical regions we were given and gave them an arbitrary color assignment. This color assignment was later converted to a normalized grayscale coloring corresponding to the bandwidth demand we found for those subregions, black being no demand, white being the maximum demand we found. And this image was encoded into a 2x2 matrix of pixels with these corresponding scalar values. So starting with a single node, we had to determine 2 things: the positioning of the node and its function, whether it's a low or medium or high strength node. And the node position in the grayscale image has a certain radius of effect and strength of effect. And all the pixels underneath this area would be reduced or darkened to varying degrees, one under the radius of a node, thus lowering the net bandwidth demand of the region. So as far as the optimization process of placing these nodes, we use simulating annealing to find a global optimal solution versus local optima. And in search of a placement and function that would meet the region's bandwidth demand entirely. And if it cannot be met entirely, we add a new node and repeat the optimization process. The way simulating annealing actually works is it sort of serves as a local optimization, but moves randomly with a cooling method to a new, better or worse location and repeats the local search by exploring the entire search space for solutions rather than searching for local solutions. And eventually it converges to this global solution, despite these random movements, which over time are less and less random.
And as for the results of this simulated annealing for region A, we found that it would require 1 medium broadband placed roughly at the center of the region. For region B, it would require 3 medium broadbands. And for region C, it would require 1 high broadband. And a strength of this sort of visual model is that it allows us to verify independently sort of how these sort of broadbands would cater to the region's bandwidth demands. So we can kind of look at the area and the required bandwidth and kind of check that it really does cover the entire region.
All right, thank you.
Great, thanks so much. So we'll take judge questions, but before we do, let's just give a round of applause to the students for the great presentation and their great modeling. I can kick us off with a question. So I thought this agent-based model you used in part 1 was really interesting. And I liked how you verified that it was giving reasonable output by comparing to a regression model, which used historical data. To follow up on that approach, would there have been a way to incorporate historical data into the agent-based model, possibly to change some of its parameters or adjust it if it did not seem to align with the data you observed?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that if we did not see that the results match in the way that we expected, one of the first things we would have changed would have been the initial parameters in terms of how fast internet service providers expand. Because if we had to say like which of our assumptions were the least justified, it would have to be those expansion rates, right? Because we chose expansion rates that made sense, and then when you combine expansion rates with number of internet service providers, when you put those two variables together, we get expansion rates that match the historical expansion rates. So that that kind of justified those two variables. But if the results had not fit what we expected, those would have been the first things to change, because I mean expansion rates could have changed over the next decade or whatnot, and there's a lot of possibility for modifying how the agents act in those parameters.
And how would you have gone about changing those? Like, you could have tried, I guess, different numbers.
Yeah, well, we probably would have changed those values such that they fit the historical expansion rates that we observed. That would have been our first guess of what just to change those values to in the MATLAB code, because we will use to find those constants at the start, which makes it very flexible. So that would have been our first move.
Okay, great, thanks. I guess I was getting at the point you could have used an optimization method to choose those parameters, like your simulated annealing method. But I mean, you had a great answer. I understand where you're going.
Yeah, definitely. That would have been a great idea.
Okay, my turn. Guys, we've got a short time here. I'm going to be critical. I'm going to ask you some hard questions. If we had a longer time, I'd start off politely, but let's dive right in. Do you remember? Okay, this is about the technical computing challenge, technical computing part of the award. Do you remember how much of the code was you included in the appendix?
I believe we included. Sorry, continue.
How much of your you gave a great presentation. I love your presentation, right? How much of the presentation you gave today could be done with the code you have in the appendix?
I believe our results are the same results that we present, or that we had on our paper, and we attached the code we use then. So I believe the code is more or less identical. I know I went back through my code to just proofread and to do a little bit more commenting, because I did put screenshots in my code, but my results have not changed.
Okay.
One thing that we did do.
Go ahead.
So all the code should be the same and should be included in the appendix. But some of the analysis we did with that code of the historical analysis starting with 2012 data to calculate 2020 price, that is new. But the code is the exact same.
So the first thing I saw was the code. I said, oh boy, technical computing. The other judges have decided this is a good technical computing paper, and I went straight to your appendix. I didn't read your paper. I just read the appendix. And I said, what are these guys doing? I couldn't tell from the appendix. The word agent does not appear in the code. The phrase Monte Carlo does not appear in the code. If you look, simulated is, so we have a MATLAB function called simulated with bounds or something. You call that function, but there's no explanation in the code of what that's doing. That's what concerns me, is can you read your code and learn what's going on here?
So we have after the fact. So one of the things that there's a regret we have from our time doing the challenge is we didn't really have time to comment the code at all because of the 14-hour time frame, because we're very focused on proofreading the paper and submitting at the very end. So we have commented the code since then, and we're happy to share that with you. But we weren't able to.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's the answer to my next question. You already answered it. And that is, I know you don't have time to write a program. I couldn't write a program. I'm the world's first MATLAB programmer, okay? And I couldn't write a MATLAB program in 14 hours that I want to share with other people. That's hard. And you guys didn't have time to do it. And the code shows that. I'm glad you've commented it. That was my next question. If you had more time, what would you do with your code? And you just answered that. So, one more thing. On your graph, your presentation today, you have some graphs on your presentation. Can you bring one of those up? What I'm worried about is the graphs don't have any labels on the axes. I don't know what you're graphing.
Oh yeah. So some of the graphs don't, but I think some of them.
No, go back. We just went past one. That one does. Do you know about that one? Do you know about the cartoon XKCD? Have you ever seen that?
I
Yeah.
am familiar.
XKCD is a wonderful internet cartoon. The poor guy has a breakup with his girlfriend because he doesn't label his axes. And she won't go out with anybody who doesn't label the axes. So label your axes, guys. I don't know what this graph's about. Thank you very much. I want to talk to you more about it, but let some other people in here.
Thanks, Cleve. Kelly, do you have any questions for the team?
Sure. First, I just want to say that I do label my axes and I'm still married. So in your code,
because you do label your axes. Yeah. Okay.
that's right. So in your code for the Monte Carlo simulation for the second one, I believe, you put the simulation that you run in a loop and do it 100 times. And then you plot 100 different histograms for each run.
Not quite. So given the house, for each person in the household, we have the information. So for household one, I think like the first person, we get age 30, income 60,000, they're employed. And then from that, I take that as like a base profile and generate a series of more detailed profiles around that. So there will be ones where this person is also in school, because that's something we don't know. We're not given if they're in school or not. So we can't make that assumption. So we generate profiles where they're in school. We do ones where we do ones for if they are like, if we assume they're in school, we also do ones where the person's doing virtual learning or they're doing in-person learning. And for each of these like slightly different profiles, I run the simulation and then we aggregate the results from each of the 100 different profiles.
Right. So I'm looking
at
on
one histogram that's shown.
Well, so I'm looking on page 30 here in your original paper, and I see that you collected. So it's inside that loop where you do it 100 times, and I see you're collecting the data. And then for each run, you're plotting a histogram. But I don't see what you're doing with the data afterwards.
So you're looking at the...
Sorry, this is dropping a lot of details here, but...
Right. Okay. I do. Right, that would indicate that I would plot 100 histograms. Could you come back to me in like 3 minutes while I look at this?
Okay. Yeah, sorry, no, I understand. It's a very specific detail, so.
Thank you.
In terms of your simulated annealing, when you, at each step, you say you make a move for your node. How do you decide how to move the node?
So this happens independently because MATLAB thankfully provides a simulated annealing solver of some sort. So the parameters that I'm changing in particular might be how the cooling algorithm operates, at what rate is the cooling actually happening, which might affect how quickly it moves to a local minimum versus how quickly it searches the state space, and other things, including the stopping criteria, whether we're looking for a specific output value, iterations, actual processing time, those sort of things. So the actual moves themselves are happening independently within an algorithm, very deeply under the covers of MATLAB itself. So, right.
What if you had
those
to
aren't
guess how
actually-
that part's implemented? What would you guess?
My guess would be that it's some sort of discretized local solver. MATLAB has a few optimization techniques. One of the local ones are like a local search. I believe it's what they maybe call it. And that's a discretized method, which with a certain step in the state space, maybe we're talking about regions, we look at a jump of 10 pixels. It's going through the entire state space, looking for an optimum, that sort of thing. So as it makes these moves locally, might be using one of its local toolboxes, might be pulling from that. This would be something that might be actually useful to ask Mr. Muller.
I didn't know we had a simulated annealing program. I learned that by reading yours. I learned that from you. I don't know how long we've had it, and I don't know where it came from. From what I understand about simulated annealing, your description, guess that it's using one of the other minimizers locally is not what I understand, but your guess is as good as mine at this point.
I think this would be a
So
reasonable
let's-
approach, though. So I appreciate that answer. I think this would be one possible way
Yeah.
to do that inner loop.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. That is, yeah.
Okay, so I want to give us, we only have a couple minutes left. Did we want to loop back to the answer to Dr. Black's question, or would it be better
Yeah,
to take that offline?
I can just talk about that for a second.
Okay, cool.
This is just kind of embarrassing. It's just it's a typo. That line where it plots a histogram is supposed to be outside of the for loop. It's supposed to take the aggregated results, not plot histograms for each individual run.
Okay, so an extra tab was put in there.
Yes.
Okay. And that should be, instead of the Y, it should be the data.
Yes.
Okay,
Sorry for the confusion there.
no problem.
Look on the very first page of the appendix. Does any of you have it there? Where it says got a for loop on I, and inside the for loop it says I equals I plus 1.
Yeah, have that open.
Well, look very carefully. Do you see a little red line under the first I in the inside?
Yeah.
Why is that little red line there? Do you know?
You shouldn't be iterating I inside of a for loop that already iterates it for you.
Yeah, right.
You're doing a double
that's
iteration.
Yeah, there's a warning that if you look over on the right in the editor, there'll be a warning, and it says you're not supposed to do that. MATLAB will let you run the program, but anyway.
I think that about
That's
wraps
one of
us
the
up,
first things.
But I hope you can carry this forward. I think the time you got grilled on MATLAB code by the creator of MATLAB is going to be one for the books. So we really appreciated all the work you did. We just want to remind you that there were hundreds of teams in this competition, and you came out in the top 3 of the technical computing teams, which is really impressive. That's something you should be proud of. It's certainly something we were very proud of the work you did. So congratulations.
I second Chris's comment there. Congratulations, guys, and thanks for putting up with me.
And we'll see you guys at the award ceremony. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you again.
Good work. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank
Have a
you
good
all,
one.
guys.
Great job.